The elegant restaurant on Fifth Avenue had always been Marcus Wellington's favorite refuge from the chaos of his business empire. At 62 years old, the real estate mogul had dined in the finest establishments across 3 continents, but there was something about this particular place that kept drawing him back. Perhaps it was the understated luxury of the cream-colored walls adorned with original oil paintings, or the way the crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the mahogany tables. Whatever it was, Marcus found himself here every Thursday evening, seated at his usual corner table where he could observe the other patrons while enjoying his meal in relative privacy. On this particular Thursday in late autumn, Marcus arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, just as he had done for the past 8 years. The maître d', a distinguished gentleman named Henry who had long since memorized Marcus's preferences, greeted him with a subtle nod and escorted him to his table. Marcus ordered his usual Scotch neat and began reviewing some financial documents he had brought along in his leather briefcase. The restaurant was moderately busy, filled with the soft murmur of conversations and the gentle clinking of silverware against fine china. As Marcus sipped his drink and scanned through quarterly reports, he barely noticed when a new waitress approached his table. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back into a simple ponytail and an apron that looked slightly too large for her slender frame. Her name tag read Sarah in neat block letters. She greeted him politely and took his dinner order with an efficiency that suggested she had been doing this job for quite some time, though Marcus was certain he had never seen her here before. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the interaction. Sarah brought his food promptly, refilled his water glass without being asked, and checked on him at appropriate intervals. She was professional and courteous, but Marcus barely registered her presence beyond the functional role she played in his evening routine. His mind was occupied with more pressing matters, including a potential acquisition in Brooklyn that was proving more complicated than anticipated. The restaurant began to empty as the evening wore on, and by 9 o'clock, only a handful of tables remained occupied. Marcus had finished his meal and was nursing a cup of coffee when he noticed Henry speaking animatedly with Sarah near the kitchen entrance. The maître d' seemed distressed about something, gesturing toward the far corner of the dining room where a magnificent grand piano sat silent and gleaming under a spotlight. Marcus had always admired the instrument, but had never actually heard anyone play it during his visits. He had assumed it was purely decorative, a beautiful piece of furniture meant to enhance the ambience rather than serve any practical purpose. Henry walked over to Marcus's table with an apologetic expression that immediately piqued the millionaire's curiosity. The maître d' explained that they had scheduled a pianist for the evening, a tradition on Thursday nights that Marcus had somehow always missed during his earlier dinner hours. Unfortunately, the regular pianist had called in sick at the last minute, leaving them without musical entertainment for the guests who had specifically made reservations expecting live performance. Henry seemed genuinely troubled by this breach of the restaurant's standards. Marcus assured Henry that he personally didn't mind the absence of music and that the situation was hardly a catastrophe. But Henry, ever the perfectionist, continued to fret about disappointing the other diners. It was then that Sarah, who had been clearing a nearby table, quietly mentioned something to Henry that Marcus couldn't quite hear. The maître d's eyes widened, and he looked at her with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. A brief, hushed conversation followed, with Sarah shaking her head and Henry becoming increasingly insistent. Finally, Sarah set down her tray and with visible reluctance walked toward the piano. Marcus watched with growing interest as she settled onto the bench and adjusted its height. Her movements were tentative, almost apologetic, as if she were afraid of drawing attention to herself. Several other diners had also noticed and turned in their seats, curious about what was happening. The restaurant fell into an expectant silence. Sarah sat motionless for a long moment, her hands hovering above the keys. From his vantage point, Marcus could see her take a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling as if she were gathering courage for something far more daunting than serving tables. There was a vulnerability in her posture that struck him as oddly moving. Here was a young woman who clearly hadn't planned on being the center of attention tonight, yet circumstances had thrust her into the spotlight. When her fingers finally touched the keys, the first notes that filled the air were so soft that Marcus had to strain to hear them. But within moments, those tentative sounds blossomed into something entirely unexpected. The melody that emerged from the grand piano was hauntingly beautiful, a classical piece that Marcus recognized as Chopin, though he couldn't name the specific composition. What struck him immediately was not just the technical precision of her playing, but the raw emotion she poured into every phrase. Marcus set down his coffee cup, completely forgetting about the financial reports spread before him. Around the restaurant, other conversations had ceased entirely. Waiters stopped mid-stride, holding their trays aloft as if frozen in time. The remaining diners sat transfixed, their desserts and after-dinner drinks forgotten. The transformation in the room was palpable, as if Sarah had cast a spell that held everyone captive. As she played, Marcus found himself studying her face in profile. Her eyes were closed, and her expression had shifted from nervous apprehension to something that looked almost like peace, or perhaps an escape into a world where she wasn't a waitress in a borrowed apron, but rather exactly where she belonged. The chop-in piece concluded with a delicate resolution that seemed to hang in the air long after Sarah's hands lifted from the keys. For a moment, the restaurant remained suspended in absolute silence, as if no one wanted to be the first to break the spell. Then applause erupted, not the polite golf clap that usually accompanied restaurant entertainment, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. Sarah's eyes opened, and the peaceful expression vanished, replaced by something that looked like embarrassment mixed with surprise. She stood quickly, gave a small, awkward bow, and hurried back toward the kitchen as if she wanted to disappear. Marcus found himself clapping along with the others, but his mind was racing with questions. Who was this young woman? Or had she learned to play like that? And more puzzling still, why was someone with such extraordinary talent waiting tables? He had heard plenty of skilled musicians over the years at concert halls and private performances, had even funded a music scholarship program at a prestigious conservatory. But there was something different about what he had just witnessed. It wasn't just technical skill, it was the kind of playing that suggested years of serious training and a deep personal connection to the music. Henry appeared at Marcus's table, his earlier distress transformed into barely contained excitement. He spoke rapidly about how Sarah had only mentioned in passing that she had studied piano, that she had been incredibly reluctant to play, and that he had no idea she possessed such talent. The maitre d' seemed almost as stunned as everyone else. Marcus asked if Sarah would play another piece, and Henry hurried off to make the request. Through the kitchen door's window, Marcus could see Henry speaking with Sarah, who was shaking her head vigorously. She appeared to be protesting, her hands moving in animated gestures of refusal. But Henry was persistent, and eventually, with what looked like great reluctance, Sarah removed her apron and walked back to the piano. This time, she didn't hesitate as long before beginning. The piece she chose was completely different from the chop-in, a dynamic Rachmaninoff composition that showcased not just her sensitivity but her technical prowess. As her fingers flew across the keys, Marcus noticed details he had missed before. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that only came from countless hours of practice. The way she leaned into certain passages, the subtle movements of her shoulders and back, everything about her physicality suggested someone who had been trained by masters. This wasn't a hobby pianist or someone who had taken lessons as a child and retained a bit of skill. This was a serious musician, perhaps even a virtuoso, hiding in plain sight behind a waitress uniform. When the Rachmaninoff ended, the applause was even more vigorous. One elderly gentleman at a corner table stood up, prompting others to rise as well. Sarah accepted the standing ovation with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort, her cheeks flushed. Marcus noticed tears glistening in her eyes before she quickly wiped them away. She bowed again, more gracefully this time, and returned to the piano bench as several diners called out requests. Over the next 40 minutes, Sarah played a varied repertoire that ranged from classical masters to jazz standards, and even a few contemporary pieces that Marcus didn't recognize. Each performance revealed another layer of her musicality. She could be thunderously powerful in one moment and achingly tender in the next. The restaurant had transformed into an impromptu concert hall, with new customers actually being turned away at the door because every table was now occupied by people who refused to leave. Marcus remained at his table long past his usual departure time, absolutely captivated. He had canceled business dinners for far less interesting reasons, and there was nowhere else he wanted to be. Between pieces, he observed Sarah carefully. During the brief intermissions, her demeanor shifted back to something guarded and uncertain. She would glance toward the kitchen as if considering making an escape, but the encouraging looks from Henry and the enthusiastic audience seemed to keep her at the piano. It was nearly 11 o'clock when Sarah finally played what she announced would be her last piece of the evening. She chose something slower, more introspective, a Debussy composition that felt like moonlight translated into sound. As the final notes faded, Marcus made a decision. He had built his fortune partly on recognizing potential where others saw nothing remarkable, and he wasn't about to let this extraordinary talent slip away into the night without at least understanding her story. As the crowd dispersed, leaving generous tips not just for their servers but specifically for Sarah, Marcus approached Henry and asked if he might speak with the young pianist. The maitre d' looked uncertain, mentioning that Sarah was quite private and might not appreciate the attention, but he agreed to ask. Marcus returned to his table and waited, watching as Henry spoke quietly with Sarah near the piano. She looked over at Marcus with an expression that seemed equal parts curious and wary, then slowly nodded. Sarah approached Marcus's table with the same tentative quality she had shown when first sitting at the piano. Up close, Marcus could see that she looked exhausted, not just from the unexpected performance but from something deeper, a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical fatigue. He stood as she arrived and gestured to the chair across from him, inviting her to sit. She hesitated for a moment before accepting, perching on the edge of the seat as if ready to flee at any moment. Marcus introduced himself properly, though he suspected she might already know who he was. His face appeared in the business section of newspapers often enough. He told her honestly that her playing had been extraordinary, perhaps the most moving performance he had experienced in years, and he wanted to understand how someone with her obvious talent and training had ended up working as a waitress. Sarah's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, suspicion, defensiveness, before finally settling on something that looked like resignation. She began her story slowly, her voice quiet but steady. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the daughter of a high school music teacher who recognized her gift when she was barely 4 years old. Her childhood had been consumed by piano lessons, practice sessions, and competitions. By age 12, she was winning state championships. By 16, she had been accepted to one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the country with a full scholarship. Her teachers had called her a prodigy, predicted a brilliant future as a concert pianist, spoke of her in the same breath as legendary performers. The conservatory years had been intense, Sarah explained. She practiced 8 to 10 hours daily, studied under masters who demanded perfection, and performed in recitals that were attended by critics and talent scouts. Everything was going according to plan. She graduated with highest honors, secured representation from a respected agency, and began booking performances at respected venues. Her debut at Carnegie Hall had been scheduled for 3 years ago, a milestone that should have launched her professional career. Then her mother became ill. Sarah paused in her story and Marcus noticed her hands trembling slightly. The diagnosis had been aggressive pancreatic cancer and the prognosis was grim. Her father, overwhelmed by the medical bills and the emotional toll, had fallen into a deep depression. Sarah, an only child, faced an impossible choice. She could pursue her musical dreams while her parents struggled alone, or she could set aside everything she had worked for to help her family through the crisis. She chose her family. Sarah moved back home, took a leave of absence from her performance schedule that she knew would likely become permanent, and spent every moment either caring for her mother or working multiple jobs to help cover the mounting medical expenses that insurance wouldn't touch. Her mother had fought for 18 months before passing away, and by then Sarah's career momentum had completely dissipated. The agency dropped her. The Carnegie Hall debut never happened. The musical world, she learned, had a short memory and little patience for pianists who disappeared regardless of their reasons. After her mother's death, Sarah had tried to rebuild. She moved to New York, the city where she had once imagined herself performing in grand concert halls. But the reality of the music world proved brutal. Without agency representation and with a gap in her performance history, she couldn't secure auditions for the positions she wanted. She took jobs playing at hotel lounges and private parties, gigs that paid poorly and felt like a betrayal of her training. The depression that followed was crippling. Marcus listened without interrupting, his businessman's instinct to solve problems held in check by a recognition that Sarah needed to tell this story in her own way. She explained that she had stopped playing piano entirely about 6 months ago. The instrument that had once been her greatest joy had become a painful reminder of everything she had lost. She needed to eat to pay rent, so she took the waitressing job. It was honest work, she said with a touch of defiance, and it allowed her to survive without touching a piano. Tonight had been the first time in half a year that she had played, Sarah continued. She had only mentioned her background to Henry in passing weeks ago during a casual conversation, never imagining he would remember or that circumstances would push her back to the keyboard. When he had asked her to fill in, her first instinct had been to refuse absolutely. But something in his desperation, or perhaps something in her own need that she hadn't fully acknowledged, made her say yes. As she spoke, Marcus saw the tears she had been holding back begin to fall. Sarah wiped at them impatiently, apologizing for the display of emotion. She seemed embarrassed to be sharing so much with a stranger, but Marcus suspected that she hadn't talked about any of this with anyone in a long time. The words seemed to pour out of her as if a dam had broken. Marcus sat quietly for a moment after Sarah finished speaking, processing everything she had shared. He had encountered many talented people over the years who had been derailed by circumstances, bad luck, or poor decisions. But there was something about Sarah's story that struck him differently. She hadn't failed due to lack of discipline or talent. She had made a conscious choice to sacrifice her dreams for something she valued more, and the world had punished her for it. He asked her a simple question. Did she still love music, or had the pain of the past few years destroyed that love? Sarah looked surprised by the directness of the question. She sat silent for a long moment, her eyes distant, before answering. She said that tonight, when her fingers first touched the piano keys after so many months, she had felt something she thought was gone forever. The music had still been there, waiting for her. Playing those pieces had reminded her of who she had been before grief and disappointment had reshaped her. So yes, she still loved it, even though that love hurt terribly. Marcus made her an offer. He explained that he had established a foundation years ago that supported artists and musicians, though he admitted he had become somewhat disconnected from its day-to-day operations. He wanted to help her, not out of pity, but because he recognized that talent like hers was too rare to let circumstances destroy it. He could connect her with people in the music world, help her secure auditions, provide financial support while she rebuilt her career. He asked only that she be willing to try again, to give herself another chance. Sarah's reaction wasn't what Marcus expected. Instead of gratitude or excitement, she looked almost angry. She told him that she appreciated the offer, but that she had learned to be suspicious of promises from wealthy benefactors who showed up with solutions to problems they didn't truly understand. She had been burned before by people who made grand gestures that fell apart when they lost interest or when helping her became inconvenient. She couldn't afford, emotionally or practically, to pin her hopes on another disappointment. Marcus respected her skepticism. He didn't try to convince her or make bigger promises. Instead, he simply gave her his card and told her that the offer would remain open whether she contacted him tomorrow or 6 months from now. He meant what he said, and she could verify everything about his foundation with a simple internet search. The choice was entirely hers. He stood, thanked her again for the extraordinary performance, and prepared to leave. As Marcus put on his coat, Sarah called out to him. She asked why he cared. He was a real estate developer, not someone from the music world. He had no obligation to her and nothing to gain from helping an unknown waitress with a failed career. What was really motivating this offer? Marcus turned back and gave her the most honest answer he could. He told her that he had spent decades building buildings, accumulating wealth, and making deals, and most of it felt hollow. The performance he had witnessed tonight had moved him more than anything had in years. If he could play even a small role in ensuring that more people got to experience what he had experienced, then perhaps some of his success would actually mean something. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, searching for insincerity or hidden motives. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because her expression softened. She took his card and promised to think about his offer. She made no commitments, but she didn't dismiss the possibility either. Marcus nodded, understanding that this was as much as he could reasonably expect. 3 months later, Marcus attended a recital at a mid-sized concert hall in Manhattan. Sarah was performing as part of a showcase for emerging artists, an opportunity that his foundation had helped arrange. She played with the same emotional depth and technical brilliance he remembered from that Thursday evening at the restaurant, but there was something different now. The vulnerability was still there in her playing, but it was balanced by a new confidence, a sense that she had made peace with her journey and was ready to move forward. The performance received a standing ovation and excellent reviews in the classical music press. It wasn't Carnegie Hall, not yet, but it was a genuine new beginning. After the recital, Sarah found Marcus in the crowd. She thanked him not just for the practical help, but for believing in her when she had stopped believing in herself. Marcus told her that he hadn't done anything except recognize what was already there. The courage to try again, the willingness to be vulnerable, the decision to trust despite past disappointments, all of that had been her choice. As Marcus left the concert hall that evening, walking out into the cool New York night, he felt something he rarely experienced anymore. A sense of having done something that truly mattered. His buildings would stand for decades, monuments to his business acumen, but helping Sarah reclaim her musical voice felt like a different kind of legacy entirely. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important things we build aren't made of steel and concrete, but of second chances and restored hope. The waitress who had sat at the piano had reminded the millionaire of something essential. That extraordinary gifts could be hidden in ordinary places, that circumstances could obscure but not destroy true talent, and that sometimes all someone needed was for one person to pay attention, to really see them, and to believe that their story didn't have to end with disappointment. Sarah's journey back to music wasn't complete, and there would surely be more challenges ahead, but she was moving forward again, and that made all the difference. Sonnet 4. 5. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.